Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, the EU made an historic decision today in response to the influx of refugees and migrants. It may be late and modest compared to the size of the issue, but quotas are being imposed on member states to ease the burden of new arrivals on the countries where most of them arrive. Britain, by the way, is not involved, having an opt-out. Now, the decision was historic for two reasons. One, it was imposed on 4 countries that didn't want to accept asylum seekers. But it was also historic as a step in the evolution of the Schengen zone. The original agreement for a borderless Europe was a kind of halfway house. The borders were removed, but there was no common asylum or immigration policy. Today, Europe took a small step towards one. A lot to take in. Our economics correspondent, Duncan Weldon, joins me. Duncan, pretty significant moment.
A hugely significant moment for Europe, both in terms, as you say, of stepping towards a common immigration policy, taking some admittedly very small steps to deal with some admittedly small steps to deal with the influx of migrants and refugees into Europe, but perhaps even more significant in terms of how it was passed. It was passed using what's known as qualified majority voting. Now, usually on something very, very contentious, something involving sovereignty, control of borders, the EU tries very hard to get consensus. They didn't get that today. This is being imposed over the wishes of 4 member states, with a 5th, Finland, abstaining.
And Slovakia's Prime Minister said it's not going to happen while I'm Prime Minister. What does happen if a country says, I'm not going to do it?
Well, I think actually there are a lot of people in Brussels and a lot of Eastern European governments tonight asking themselves what happens if a government just refuses to take in these numbers. Now, we might get some more clarity on that tomorrow when the heads of government meet. But at the moment, despite all of the talk in the days running up to today's summit, there'd be some sort of automatic financial penalty. That does not seem to have been imposed. So if someone says we're not taking anyone, it will go through the EU's normal procedures, which, as we know, will drag on for months and potentially years.
That's dealing with the countries. Now, migrants, refugees assigned to countries by the quota. What is to stop them moving once they've been put in one country if they prefer to move to Germany?
Very little. It is in an area of the Schengen zone with free movement across Europe. It is going to be very hard to keep people in a country they don't want to be in. Germany at the moment finds it hard enough to keep people in Eastern Germany when they want to be in Western Germany. Now, there's talk of tying benefits to staying in a certain country, although that's challengeable under European law. There's talk that the host country will have to make sure they're there by sending around people to check. Now, again, possibly very unlikely. This is the real feeling in Eastern and Central Europe tonight. Eastern and Central Europe tonight. A lot of political goodwill has been burned by this being imposed on them, and they think all of this political goodwill has been burned for a system which simply will not be able to be effective.
Duncan, thanks, and we'll have a report from you in a few minutes. But first, a little earlier, I spoke to David Miliband. He's in New York, where he's president of the International Rescue Committee. He's been very active in the argument over refugees in Europe and the US. And I asked him whether he agreed that a quota system is the only way Europe can respond to the refugee crisis.
I think that's one essential part of a response to what is now a European crisis, not just a Syrian crisis. That distribution of refugees around Europe is essential to cope with this influx that we've been warning about for the last 9 to 12 months. But of course, it has to be allied to much more effective humanitarian and political effort in the region. Right. Notably Syria.
Now, I notice you are using the word refugees. What proportion of those people coming in do you think are what you might call fleeing war-torn war areas, and what proportion would you consider to be classic migrants, economic migrants who are seeking a better life in Germany?
Let me tell you the experience I had last weekend in Lesbos, the Greek island, where about half of all the refugees arriving in Europe are coming through. It's about 3,000 a day, just in the latest report we had for Saturday and Sunday. What I saw was probably 50 to 60% are from Syria. They're talking about barrel bombs from Assad and terror from ISIS. Prima facie, they have a very good claim to be fleeing persecution, to have a well-founded fear of persecution. There are then another 15 to 20% who are probably from Afghanistan, and their detailed work is necessary. Different parts of Afghanistan are in a different state. I think there's also a significant minority from Eritrea. That leaves you with 15% who might be from different regions. Obviously, I'm not saying that everyone who comes to Europe is a refugee, and last year the EU returned about 98,000 people back to the countries they'd come from because they didn't qualify for refugee status.
Now, how does a quota work in the borderless Schengen region? I mean, what stops there being a quota of refugees assigned to a country and then just merrily moving along to Germany, which is probably where they'd prefer to be? How do you stop that?
Well, I think that people will go, in my experience, where they're given safety and where they're given a chance to make a new life for themselves. And it was very striking to me, talking to the refugees I met last weekend. Yes, they do say Germany. Yes, they do say Sweden. Very few, interestingly enough, say the UK. But they all say, I want to go somewhere where I can rebuild my life. It's evident that if people are resettled, that their funding will be associated with their resettlement in the country that they go in. Their working conditions and housing and other support will be based on that.
And you're thinking a permanent new life in the country to which they are assigned, not a temporary life for them to return to Syria when, God help us, the war actually comes to an end and a new settlement's found there.
Well, a refugee status is not the same as a citizenship status, and refugees are there with rights and for them and responsibilities for states. Many of the people, despite the horrors of what they've been through, they do say, I'd love one day to go back to Syria. So it's neither the case legally nor factually that a refugee is bound to stay. Obviously, the longer a refugee is in a new country, the more likely it is that they'll put down roots and the more likely it is that they will stay.
Well, look, you've been critical of countries in Europe, Hungary most notably, who've been playing hardball and who think the solution to this is to build sharper razor wire and higher fences. And you've said that is not a good approach. And that's clear. I understand the argument there. What should Europe do if the numbers grow immeasurably? What should Europe do if the numbers grow by, say, twice, 3 times, 10 times the current numbers? There clearly are lots of people in the world living in places that are miserable. How should Europe approach that? Should it allow itself then to become hardball? Or should Europe just accommodate any number who attempt to make that journey?
I don't think this is about hardball or softball. It's about clever ball. It's about whether or not the approach you're taking is a genuinely strategic response to the crisis. And the strategic response has to act on the symptoms and on the causes. The reason I say that the Hungarian approach is so misguided and short-sighted is that the bigger the fence is, the more you empower the criminal gangs to get round them. And that's exactly what's been happening. And it's a matter of, and clever ball means attacking the roots of the problem and genuinely trying to make life bearable in the neighbouring states of a country like Syria that's consumed by a civil war. The message, I think, to Europe is to get serious about distributing the refugees inside its own continent. Secondly, to get serious about legal routes to refugee status that do sort out refugees from economic immigrants, but also undercut the criminal gangs. And thirdly, to make sure that there is sufficient humanitarian aid in the neighbouring states to staunch the flow, never mind the wider political question about how this war in Syria is brought to an end before it goes from 5 years to 10 years to 15 years.
And fifthly, the thing you didn't say in your plan, be much tougher with the economic immigrants and put them on 747s and send them home, rather than accommodate them here if Europeans don't feel they can cope with all the refugees and all the migrants who want to come.
You're absolutely right to say that economic immigrants do not have the right to come to Europe. They have a right to apply, and Europe has a right to say no. And that's why nearly 100,000 were sent back last year, and that's got to be part of any sensible system.
David Miliband, thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, before we debate some of the issues involved in the EU adopting quotas, let's just step back and reflect on the demographics and the economics. Here's Duncan's brief guide to the debate.
Almost 500,000 migrants have arrived in Europe this year, welcomed in some places and feared in others. Today, the European Union took steps to share them around the continent. Some see them as a burden, others as an opportunity. All agree the situation is serious.
This is a manageable crisis, but in order to be manageable, it needs to be managed. And this is what we have been calling on the EU and the EU member states to address in a coherent, collective and coordinated manner. Only a collective response to this crisis by the Europeans will actually be able to cope with it.
Greece's crisis-hit economy is struggling to cope with the numbers. But elsewhere in the continent, some spy a solution to one of Europe's bigger, longer-term problems: poor demographics and a declining population.
As the population ages, the number of people in employment will shrink and the number of pensioners will rise. And that's going to put huge pressures on the public finances. If there were more migrants to come in, particularly those of a young age, as we're seeing, in the medium term, migrants will provide more in taxes than they will take in benefits. And clearly that will boost the number of skills and the people in employment. So it should be a positive thing for Germany or Europe more generally.
In the medium term, migration should provide an economic boost. But the OECD today warned that in the short term it brings costs. And the benefits can only be unlocked if people become integrated. For some, though, the problem goes well beyond any short-term financial costs. Poland saw protests last week. The world's been here before. In the last half of the 19th century, the US saw huge numbers of people arriving, most of them Catholic. In just 50 years, the country went from being almost entirely Protestant to 1/5 Catholic. The seeds of US economic success were sown, but the changing makeup of the country provoked extreme tensions. Even for many refugees fleeing conflict, economics plays a role in where they want to settle.
At first I was in India, didn't help us. Over there we didn't find any work, and then we left over there, then we gone in Iran. Over in Iran, they didn't have any, didn't give us work, they didn't help us, they didn't want us to be on Iran. On that time we left Turkey, and Turkey we come over there.
Wherever they arrive, wherever they come from, and whatever the quotas say, many are heading for Germany.
Duncan Weldon's report there. Right, joining me from Oxford is Professor Paul Collier from Oxford University, and from Brussels, the Green MEP, German MEP, Ska Keller, who was the European Parliament's draftsperson on the original redistribution scheme. Good evening to you both. Let's start on whether quotas work. Professor Collier, does this make a tangible, significant difference to the migration and refugee issue in Europe?
Not really. I mean, more importantly, it doesn't make much of a difference to the real refugee problem, which is the displacement of millions of Syrians. Most of those millions are in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and that's where we need to be focusing European resources. And this is just a distraction, I think motivated by Germany's attempt to lay the ghosts of its own dark past.
Right. Ska Keller, do you think this makes a tangible difference to the refugee problem?
Yes, I think it does. Of course, it's correct to say that 120,000 are a very, very small number compared to the many people that have to flee from Syria and other places. But for the EU, it's an important step forward because, as also your colleagues have been pointing out earlier, we, for the first time probably in the Home Affairs area, we had a decision with qualified majority. It's now accepted. There needs to be a solidarity mechanism. So this can, or at least can be, maybe it is not, but it can be the start. It has the potential to be the start of a greater reform. This is what we really need. And it's very important to help those states, Greece and Italy notably, who are at the forefront, and that the others accept this responsibility is a significant step forward.
Right, significant. Hold that thought, because I want to come back to the kind of constitutional side of it, but just on the sort of the degree to which the 120,000 quotas will make a difference. You don't think it's significant, Paul Collier. What would you prefer? What is the better approach? What's the alternative?
Look, there are 10 million displaced Syrians so far. It may go up from that. What we really need to do is provide the displaced people with much better lives in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon. Those are the places that matter because, first of all, they're the places that are easy for the displaced to get to. Europe is this, Germany's lured people to pay criminal gangs, get on boats, some of them drown, come to Germany. That is an irresponsible thing to do, which many thousands have done, but it's the millions that are back that inevitably can't make that journey, don't want to make that journey. They, at the moment, are treated very badly with a system that hasn't really been changed the way we handle refugees since 1947. In particular, they're not allowed to work. What refugees need is a chance to earn a living in these places in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon.
Let me put that to
Europe
Scar Keller.
needs to put money to make that happen.
Let me put that to Scar Keller, that this policy that we've now got is distracting and potentially damagingly distracting.
I don't really think so. There is people who have been coming to Europe for years, for many years, from Syria but also elsewhere, because indeed they're looking for a long-term perspective that they can't find in Syria and Iraq and Eritrea somewhere. And we need to be able, as European Union, to first of all ensure legal and safe access for those refugees, but also distribute them fairly among the member states and deal with their asylum claims. Because we all have signed up to the Geneva Convention, we all promised to protect people in international need. We cannot say, you better stay in Turkey and Jordan, live in those refugee camps and try to get by. No, Europe has to be open. And by the way, the relocation scheme was also not a German invention. We have 28 member states, not just one that says things. It's the Commission that proposed it.
Sorry to interrupt you, but do you accept, Scar Keller, that there is such a thing as the pull factor? That if you invite people to come and say we're going to let you in and there are no strings, that you do pull people who may not be as much in need as some of those who've come?
I'm very sorry, but if you're bombed in your hometown, you don't need any pull factor. You're pushed.
And how many do you think of the people who've arrived in Germany this year are people of that description, and how many do you think are classic economic migrants?
Well, actually, what we see is classic refugees coming. There is, of course, it's changing who's coming, etc. But we have very clear definition of who's a refugee. We have actually European laws around that. So we do have European common standards, at least minimum standards that need to be followed. So that is very clear. Okay. Besides that, we also have the problem that we don't have a European system for economic migration, which we would also need in Europe. For that, we don't have a system. We urgently need to establish that. But we cannot forget we're seeing a refugee crisis. The people who are coming here, the vast majority are people who are in need of international protection, and we need to provide that protection. Okay,
we're running out of time. Paul Collier, just what proportion of those currently in the 120,000 being talked about today are refugees? What proportion migrants in your view?
Look, one of the things that happened is that as the genuine refugees try to get to Germany through the Balkans, many young people in the Balkans, seeing people go through to Germany, are saying, why not us? And so it's ignited an exodus from the Balkans. It's nothing to do with conflict, but around the world, the message has been heard, come to Germany. Germans themselves are now mutinying against that, and so in a rather heavy-handed way, Germany has forced other European countries to an act of solidarity on Germany's terms.
Just a quick last one for you, Scar, on the constitutional issue. The implication is that Europe is telling countries like Slovakia that they have to do something that they often do not want to do, something really quite important to the notion of a sovereign state.
I absolutely disagree with what Professor Collier said. The European Union is built and founded on solidarity. All the member states have voluntarily signed up to that. And all of us have to give and receive solidarity whenever it's necessary. Now it's time to give solidarity to Greece and Italy, and I would say also Hungary. But Hungary did not want to have solidarity shown to it. We have to accept that. And the 120,000, by the way, that are going to be relocated are those that are considered to be very likely to be refugees.
Scar, Paul Collier, thank you both very much.
I've been getting